in the forenoon of that day,
on Saturday morning,
9th September. While session 1 was going on, we still had some issues to be nailed down. This was obviously, you could say at one level, a source of concern or tension or whatever it is. But again, for those of us who've done a lot of these things before, this is how big international events go, that it really goes down to the wire and you've got to hold your nerve, you've got to make that last push, which is what we were doing even as people were arriving, even as between session 1 and session 2 we took a break. Even then we were still kind of
not over the line.
Well, we were trying to get everybody into confirming that they were comfortable with it. In some cases there were holds, on certain issues. So it was a kind of a live action,
like a cricket match.
Yes, till the very end.
So you did mention in the press conference as well, the emerging bloc of countries, which is Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, along with India, played a role in helping narrow down differences and finding a text that's acceptable to all. Can you elaborate on that role and what may that mean, the coming together of this emerging bloc?
Well, there's some history to it. The history to it was that last year, Indonesia was the chair, the summit was in Bali, and the kind of pressures that we felt this time, Indonesia felt last time. What we all did, at least, and I can say this particularly for ourselves, was that we really kind of batted for Indonesia very, very strongly. I remember last year even going to Moscow to meet the Russians to discuss this. Now, this time around, I think that feeling was strong among a certain group of countries, and I think particularly the 4 back-to-back chairs, Indonesia, us, Brazil, South Africa. But a few others as well, that look, we all need to come together and persuade the others to find a reasonable middle ground. So at one level, this kind of diplomacy was going on, but bear in mind that finally it isn't just a textual fix. I mean, there were real political positions at stake here. So some of it therefore also depended very much on how did the countries feel about India. So the more we were able, I mean, if I were to broadly, let us say, classify them into 3 groups, those countries who were actively working with us, so we had to enthuse them to work with us. Those countries who had strong entrenched positions, so we had to make them understand that, look, we respect your position, but surely it's important for you that the Indian presidency succeeds, and therefore to some extent it was influenced by the nature of their relationship with India. And then there were some who whose good wishes were with us, but who are waiting for things to move. Now, to some extent, this is really where PM came in very strongly, which was, by going to Indonesia, I mean, which the Indonesians appreciated enormously. That, for someone who's, for where the visitors are arriving on the 8th, to be in Indonesia on the 7th, and just to go there, just to do that. I think it not only enthused, motivated Indonesia very strongly. I think it sent a very strong message to the others as well, that look, here are all of us standing by each other and working together. It also gave him an opportunity to talk to some of the others. Some of the others he spoke there, some of the others he spoke here, and in certain specific cases, based on the feedback from the Sherpa team, I actually went to PM and said, sir, could you please have a word with, country X or country Y, and which he did. So So that's really, I mean, that last, I would say, 12 hours, 12 to 24 hours.
Nice.
But especially on the 9th itself, a lot of that happened, by his also intervening with the absolutely crucial people, because there were one or two
holdouts.
Yeah.
So tell us about this, because there has been some criticism. Ukraine has said this on record, that they believe that the language on the Russia-Ukraine war has been diluted, that Russia has not been named directly. How would you respond to that, please?
See, it's like this. As you know, the conflict started last February. We've already had one G20 meeting.
Yeah.
The G20 took a collective position out there. Now, the point is, we also all have to assess whether the purpose of a G20 gathering is to reiterate a position and sort of make that like a some kind of immutable concept from which there should be no divergence, or whether we should update that issue and bring in further developments and also capture those as part of the concerns. So, you could say, for example, there's a $100 billion commitment which was made in Paris.
Yes.
On climate change. So you could argue, well, every position therefore should only reiterate what it is, and we should not be discussing anything else. But we don't do that. We keep evolving the climate action position as we go along. So in the year that has passed, the fact is that the Black Sea grain corridor has become a source of concern. It's non-functioning. The attacks on the infrastructure are a source of concern. The fact that there is a discussion going on in groups of countries in the world is also a development which needs to be noted. But most of all, the central concern which needed to be captured was the impact of all of this on the rest of the world.
The global south.
Now, if you are you're trying to, let's say we have this as a position. Now you want to also carry this and this. I mean, in any kind of international negotiation, that core is not going to remain exactly what it was, then they will say, fine, then go with that and let's not get anything else in. So, my own sense is, I would say very respectfully to all parties who may have concerns of the kind that you have expressed, that look, this is a evolving issue. It cannot be that on the one hand you say, oh, by the way, the entire world is concerned about it, but I will not express that concern in a statement. That the concern will only be a very narrow concern, which will be a cut and paste from a previous year. So, if it is a truly global happening, which is why we are discussing it in the G20.
Correct.
Okay. Then the totality of that should be captured, no?
Sure. So the other big announcement that happened on the sidelines of the G20 was this corridor between India, the Middle East, going all the way to Western Europe. Many are saying this is in response to China's Belt and Road. I know you will say that it stands on its own merit, but we have not seen, at least in scale, something to match what China has been doing for the last 10 years with One Belt, One Road. So to that extent, to the scale extent at least, is this something that matches up to it?
Look, I think the moment you get into comparisons, you are going down a fundamentally wrong road. Okay? What is this about? This is about you have a very important economic center, historically, in human history, which today is once again regaining its place. It's the 5th largest economy. It's going to get bigger. You have another big historical economic center, Europe, and then you have countries between them, which again traditionally have played a very important role in ensuring commerce, not only between these two poles, if you would, but also between these countries in the middle and them. So yesterday evening we had a dinner for the Saudi delegation because the Crown Prince was here. And one of the Saudis actually were telling me, they said, look, we have parts of Saudi Arabia where for generations there are pathways and there are routes. Everybody knows historically these were the routes which went to and from India. He said these are places where actually people enjoyed a high standard of living. They actually had a way of living which was related to the trafficking, to the goods movement which was going there. Now, similarly with UAE, how deeply the maritime tradition, the dhows coming, the monsoon trade, etc. So we have now a certain favorable geopolitical situation where Saudi Arabia would like to step forward and facilitate a certain seamless logistical movement. You have UAE wishing to do the same. You have an India which is focused very much on Europe, a Europe which is very much focused on India. So what would you do if you are a smart strategist? You would put it all together. And so I would say in a way it's very much an evolution. On the one hand, a greater awareness in India and Europe about the merits of dealing with each other economically, but also greater awareness on both India and Europe's part of the importance of the region, especially the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula here, and of the countries themselves. So this is a big deal because the question of how to create seamless economic flows, logistical flows, is one of the big issues in world history. So the return to history, you would say.
It's going back.
And that return to history predates any belt or any road which any country may have had.
Okay. No, one of the concerns about this belt and road that we were both referring to has been about the debt sustainability. We've seen countries, smaller countries that are not able to afford and going financially broke, even closer home countries like Sri Lanka. This corridor, how may it be more sustainable? How is it envisaged to be more sustainable?
Well, just look at the players here. Okay, you are talking India, Saudi, UAE, Europe, and America, and you are even thinking debt sustainability. Okay. I mean, these are countries with deep pockets. These are countries with a strong market. They have the ability to evaluate projects and to say yes, this will work, and that will not work. So I look again. I'm not making a political point when I say don't compare. I genuinely believe that this one is different. This is a set of today contemporary leaderships very aware of the opportunities before them, taking what has been a time-tested historical concept and then trying to see if we can give it a modern incarnation, and that is why I think it's very important.
You did mention about the Green Climate Fund. It was announced many years ago in Paris. It was a $100 billion fund. Not much of that money has gone to developing countries, and now in this Delhi edition of the G20 there's been an announcement of a new Green Climate Action Plan. Where is the nub of the problem? Is it that the developed world just doesn't want to cough up the money, or is it that mechanism was not working, we're trying something new now?
No, it's not just climate action, though obviously if you look at 2023 versus let us say 2015, 2016, no question in the last 6-7 years, climate worries, climate anxieties have grown.
True.
Okay. Each one of us have experienced in our lives. I mean, our lives are hotter, wetter, colder, drier, all at the same time, and that's a bad sign.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there's a larger issue. There's a climate action issue. There's also a sustainable development goals issue, which is 3 years of COVID, 1 year of the Ukraine conflict. Where are the resources today to keep the progress? So there are a large number of countries. This was the core message coming out, when we did this Voice of Global South exercise. The core the distillation of what we gathered was really saying, look, we are on the ropes. I mean, we are cutting our nutrition, we are cutting our health, we are cutting our roads, we are cutting our education. So, I mean, for God's sake, find us some place where today we get some comfort, some easing up of the financial pressure on us. What therefore we are hoping is that the G20 Summit and what follows thereafter would find ways by which there would be more resources available for green, for development and for green development. So, and that resources is both the current institutions having more resources, the individual countries putting in more resources, but also leveraging that resources to get more resources.
So one of the things that's been mentioned in the joint declaration, PM has also been mentioning this time and time again about how India is hoping to be the voice of the global south. In a deeply divided world where you have the West, America and its partners, and you have Russia and China on the other side, and also because of the role that emerging countries like Brazil and Indonesia and other emerging, South Africa, etc., played in finding the consensus joint statement. Do you believe that countries of the South can be the bridge between these, what many are calling great power competition?
Perhaps, but I think the countries of South have their own concerns. And part of really what we saw last year and which we did not want to have a repeat of this year was that the deep concerns of the countries of the South would be buried under the pressure of the East-West friction. Yes, I would say, I mean, if you ask the bulk of the countries of the South, most of them would say, we are deeply anxious about this conflict. We really don't want to see this continue. We would like to find a way of ending it. Because we don't think it's good for the parties involved, but we don't think it's good for any of us. That it is adding to the stresses in the global fractures which are already there. So at this moment, I think it's more realistic to focus on the global South's own concerns. But that having been said, I've seen every time there's any discussion about what can we do to deal with the Ukraine conflict. I've seen the Africans sought to take an initiative. Brazil tried to do something. So countries will want to do it because it's also their way of expressing their position. Now, who knows at what point suddenly it may click.
Sure.
But where we are concerned, for us, I would say the key issue in this summit was that you take a full global perspective. You do not, prioritize one set of problems at the expense of other set of problems. That you recognize the totality of challenges, and especially we focus on what has been a source of great anxiety for the global South. And I think in that shining that spotlight on the predicament of the global South, we have been quite successful.
Before the summit began, when the Chinese president decided not to attend the Delhi G20, it was seen as a snub to India. But do you believe, with what has been achieved in the last 2 days, over Saturday and Sunday over the Delhi G20 Summit, not just India but other countries in the G20 have shown to China that if China does not want to be part of that room at the highest level, then it's China's loss, it's not the rest of the world's loss?
Look, again, it's honestly not for us to say who will go at what level to which meeting. That's a national choice. It's a national choice and we must respect that. In terms of what happened in Delhi, I would say, look, China was an important player and finally at the crucial moment China was contributive to what was overall consensus. So it was not that therefore they were not part of the conversation. They were very much in the conversations, they were very much in the negotiations. So I mean the G20 at the end of the day was 20. Every one of them played their part, their full part in that. So beyond that, what call any country takes about the level, I think that's for them to weigh the merits of it.
Because as a big advocate of multilateralism, going forward, do you see sort of competing multilateralisms? There are institutions like the G20, World Bank, IMF, etc., which one set of countries will be gung-ho about, and there are groupings like the BRICS and the SCO, where China may want to take the lead on. Do you see sort of competing multilateralisms happening?
Well, I would say that from our G20 summit, this G20 summit,
yes,
the New Delhi G20 summit, first of all, it's good for multilateralism.
It is.
It's good for multilateralism because the sense over the last many years has been, it's impossible to get everybody in the room to agree.
Yeah.
Okay. There's been actually a cynicism almost verging on, nobody even tries hard as a result. Okay. I think we reversed that. For me, one very powerful takeaway was people leaving Delhi, the other 19 delegations, would leave with that sense that, look guys, we actually got a common landing point. Yes, nobody would have said we got 100% of what we wanted, but that's always the case with a multilateral outcome, but that we got a landing point, that we were able to agree on core issues, and we did not allow differences, because there are differences. I mean, let's not pretend that there are none. That even though there are very deep differences on some issues, we had the wisdom and the foresight to come together on the issues on which we would agree. But the other part which you mentioned about BRICS, I want you to really reflect on what you yourself said. Please don't think that BRICS is something which is led by one member of the BRICS. BRICS has 5 members.
Sure.
Let me tell you, each of the 5 weighs in forcefully, actively, productively on what happens in the BRICS. We've just come out of a BRICS summit. There is a sort of a Western narrative which would ascribe to BRICS a certain kind of national ownership. I think it does a disservice to all the rest of us. This may be a kind of a polemic between China and the West, but I don't think it's a true picture, and I don't think, frankly, it's very helpful to actually understand what is happening in the BRICS either.
I do want to talk to you about one issue that cropped up again on the sidelines, one of the bilaterals that happened. The Prime Minister putting out a very strong statement to Canada on this issue of Khalistan business, the support and the safe haven that Canada or sections within Canada seem to have become. But the Canadian Prime Minister in his press conference sort of seemed to characterize this as a freedom of expression / foreign interference issue. How would you respond to that characterization?
No, I don't think there's anything for me to respond to. The Canadian Prime Minister and his system said what they had to say. I think our system said what it had to say. The particular issue, which is the space which has been given to the Khalistanis in Canada, I think is a worrisome issue. I think we have, this is one occasion, it's not a new conversation.
True.
This is part of an ongoing conversation. So I think that's really what there is to it. I would leave it at that.
Have you lent one of your aircrafts to him? I believe he had some trouble.
No, I think finally his aircraft got repaired and
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So finally, Dr. Jaishankar, I said this at the top. You and your team have been working round the clock for the last year since we got the presidency, and you finally made it happen. This is a huge success. Do you feel like Sachin Tendulkar after scoring 100 hundreds? What next for you personally?
No, look, I would say when we look, when we reflect on this G20 summit, no question, it's a very important diplomatic achievement. I'm sure someday, maybe 5 years, 10 years, somebody writing on Indian foreign policy and says, okay, this was the rise of India, they would certainly say, okay, this was a important milestone. It was an important milestone for a variety of reasons. One, it showed an Indian ability really to forge a consensus. Now, why did that happen? I'm sure, everybody worked hard. That's one part of it. But it happened because for each of those 19 countries, the relationship with India was also important. So one was the merits of the issue, but no question for them, the fact that the presidency was in India, that India was the host, was also very much a factor. You could see that. It was an opportunity for us also in many ways to demonstrate both our I would say contemporary face, the technology face. One of the interesting things I must tell you is a lot of people went. We had this place for cashless payments.
Yeah, correct.
And that was a big hit because many people really. This is interesting. Much of the G20 had never done anything like this in their own country, or a lot of the lounge conversation was really about Chandrayaan and the fact that we chose to do a really challenging location for the landing, etc. So they certainly left with a strong sense of the change in India over the last decade. But they also left with a sense that, look, here is a country proud of its civilization, very, very confident of its culture, today putting that forward. So for me, this G20 summit will be a milestone in the rise of India, that people will look back and say, look, these were steps by which India's influence, India's stature, India's image in the world really expanded. And I think that is the way it should be. And here I must say, it's not an empty phrase. We always said it was a national endeavor. And I would say that in every way, whether it was in its coverage, whether it was in its participation, which was in the showcasing, in every way it was a national endeavor.
All right. Many congratulations once again, and thank you very much for speaking with us here on CNN News.
Thank you, Zakka.
Now, each toilet will cost around 4 to 5 crores. Now, the question is, why the inflated cost? Remember, at the very same time, you have the Bengaluru developmental minister who is saying that there are no sufficient funds for new developmental works. When such is the financial state, why the inflated cost for such precast toilets, high-end precast toilets that are being proposed and built? And are these toilets worth it, is the question that is being raised. And at the very same time, the second reason, the main reason why such project is undertaken as claimed by the BBMP is that these can be built at a short span of time. Now, if you take a look at the phase 1 that was being built, around only 10 toilets, precast toilets were constructed out of the 25 proposed toilets, and it took around 2 years for them. It was started in the March 2021 and is not yet complete. And now they have proposed 46 new precast toilets. If it doesn't complete this particular 46 new toilets in the stipulated time, once again the question is being raised. The main reason why the short span time, the main reason why it was chosen is not being fulfilled yet. So what's the need for such precast toilets is the question that is being raised by the citizens of Bengaluru. What is seen as a high-end luxury project undertaken by the BBMP, the Bengaluru Civic Agency is constructing around 46 precast high-end toilets across the IT city with a whopping cost of 281 crore, with each precast toilet costing around 4 to 5 crores. Now behind me is one such precast toilet that was proposed and built by the BBMP under phase 1. So it comprises of various features such as providing dry and clean toilets, sensor-based flushing, solar-powered lights, and also ample ventilation. So these are the features that make up this high-end precast toilets proposed and built by the BBMP under phase 1. Right now the BBMP has proposed to construct 46 such new toilets, new precast toilets, which cost around 281 crore. So let's go inside and check what are the features of these high-end precast toilets that cost around that makes each toilet cost around 6 crores, around 4 to 5 to 6 crores. So it comprises of a sensor based flushing. So you have the sensor here. So usually the other BBMP toilets have a push button water feature. Now this has a sensor based flushing, so that's one of the feature. And the phase 2 of this particular high-end precast toilet comprises of water saving taps, but this is built under phase 1 and it's not in a good condition, not maintained in a good condition. The BBMP says that in the second phase, the high-end precast toilets comprise of water-saving tap fixtures, and this is a particular precast toilet is also said to be solar-powered. You have the solar-powered lights that are fixated there, and what the BBMP claims is also that it provides ample amount of ventilation. It doesn't look like it has a ample amount of ventilation here, except the fact that there are just 2 to 3 glass windows that have been placed here. So these are the features. Now this particular precast toilet is being built under the phase 1. In phase 2 now the BBMP is proposing to build around 46 toilets which cost around 281 crores, so that which I mentioned earlier. So now what's under question is the inflated cost of this particular proposed precast toilets that are being built. Now as I mentioned, under phase 2 46 new precast toilets are going to be built, and the total cost will be around 281 crores, which is equal to that of a luxury apartment. Now each toilet will cost around 4 to 5 crores. Now the question is why the inflated cost? Remember, at the very same time you have the Bengaluru developmental minister who is saying that there are no sufficient funds for new developmental works. When such is the financial state, why the inflated cost for such precast toilets, high-end precast toilets that are being proposed and built, and are these toilets worth it, is the question that is being raised. And at the very same time, the main reason why such project is undertaken as claimed by the BBMP is that these can be built at a short span of time. Now if you take a look at the phase 1 that was being built, around only 10 toilets, precast toilets were constructed out of the 25 proposed toilets, and it took around 2 years for them. It was started in the March 2021 and is not yet complete, and now they have proposed 46 new precast toilets. If it doesn't complete this particular 46 new toilets in the stipulated time, once again the question is being raised. The main reason why the short span time, the main reason why it was chosen is not being fulfilled yet. So what's the need for such precast toilets is the question that is being raised by the citizens of Bengaluru. What is seen as a high-end luxury project undertaken by the BBMP, the Bengaluru Civic Agency is constructing around 46 precast high-end toilets across the IT city with a whopping cost of 281 crore, with each precast toilet costing around 4 to 5 crores. Now behind me is one such precast toilet that was proposed and built by the BBMP under phase 1. So it comprises of various features such as providing dry and clean toilets, sensor based flushing, solar powered lights, and also ample ventilation. So these are the features that make up this high-end precast toilets proposed and built by the BBMP under phase 1. Right now the BBMP has proposed to construct 46 such new toilets, new precast toilets, which cost around 281 crore. So let's go inside and check what are the features of these high-end precast toilets that cost around that makes each toilet cost around 6 crores, around 4 to 5 to 6 crores. So it comprises of a sensor based flushing. So you have
Good evening and welcome. You're watching Viewpoint. We continue to keep our focus on that big exclusive interview with External Affairs Minister Dr. S Jaishankar. In conversation with Zakka Jacob, he mentioned how India's peculiar position has helped cement that consensus that could be arrived at the G20 Summit, which recently concluded in the national capital. He also highlighted that in the times to come, history will remember the G20 Summit as one of the critical junctures in foreign policy and diplomatic efforts and initiatives of India. My colleague Abhishek Jha with us on the broadcast. Abhishek, that exclusive conversation here on CNN News 18, the key takeaways from that conversation.
Of course, Jaishankar has actually openly talked about all the issues. Those were complex, those were controversial, and those were going to have a bearing on G20's declaration. He had talked about Russia-Ukraine conflict also, but he has broadly spoken about that the issue, though it's geopolitical in nature and it has its ramification on the other geoeconomic issues around the world. G20 was not the right platform to discuss the geopolitical angle of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and this is what the India's stand has always been. Right. And on the issue of consensus building, he said that there has been a lot of effort by all the countries, and at the end of it, the Delhi Declaration is a much satisfactory work that Indian presidency has been able to pull off.
All right. Abhishek, thank you so much for getting us that perspective. We'll continue highlighting the critical aspects of that crucial interview that has played out in CNN News 18. It will once again play out at around 9 p.m. today. Let's also cut across to our guests who are joining us on the broadcast, talking more about this interview, the success of G20, the various facets which were critical in forging the consensus that has taken everyone by pleasant surprise. Mr. Ashok Sajjanar, who's a former diplomat, with us on the broadcast. Professor Brahma Chalani, who's a strategic affairs expert, is also with us on the show. Professor Chalani, coming to you first. Dr. Jaishankar said that it's one thing that the team had put in a lot of hard work, and of course India, ever since it had assumed the presidency of G20, was working very hard round the clock to ensure that there is consensus on critical issues that can be achieved when the New Delhi summit really happens. But the peculiar position of India in today's geopolitics makes it suitable to forge consensus because it is seen as a player which is acceptable by all the sides.
You're absolutely right, Anusha, and that was the key to the success of the New Delhi summit, the fact that India enjoys the status of a bridge builder. By bridging global divides, India helped forge a consensus because few had expected the summit to be a success, given the growing international divisiveness. The war in Ukraine has created deep divide between the West and the Sino-Russian combined. There's also a Western clash with the rising global South. So given the difficult geopolitical environment, few had expected the New Delhi summit to be a success, but it was a roaring success. And the success of the summit in turn has enhanced India's international profile. This was a high point in Indian diplomacy. And this has come at a time when China is grappling with multiple crises. So this certainly will be remembered as a great success that India managed to pull off.
Absolutely. Mr. Sajjanar, coming back to you and talking about the nuance, I believe, which dominated, especially if you look at that statement and the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the manner in which India was able to forge a consensus with all the key participants, with all the member countries, nuance and ensuring that a humanitarian approach was taken was the need of the hour. And even today, when Dr. Jaishankar spoke, whether it was on the issue of China, Russia, or even Canada, the minister was very categoric and at the same time nuanced that yes, these are important issues which are dividing the world right now, say the Russia-Ukraine war, but we need to be mindful as to how we can build those bridges together.
No, you're very right, Anusha, and I agree with what you have said, what the External Affairs Minister has said. I think India is possibly one of the very few, if not the only country, which straddles across all these divides. Particularly the divide between East and West, Russia, China on one side, US, Europe, and some of the other countries on the other side, because it can talk, converse seriously and genuinely, authentically to Russia and also to the West. So I think the position of India and also the role, I would say, meaning the negotiators did do their job as they were required to do, but even the Prime Minister sort of, in so many of the issues, on Russia-Ukraine you have mentioned, but his conversation, I'm sure, with President Putin just a few days before the summit, his conversation with Joe Biden on the evening prior to the summit, I think all those definitely would have gone in a significant way to contributing. And that's the reason, as you said, meaning India is able to bridge those divides. It is seen to be an honest broker, if I can use that expression. It's seen as a unifier, it's seen as a consensus builder. So I think all these elements worked in making this summit a success.
Professor Chulani, towards the end of the conversation in that interview, the learned minister talks about the fact that when the delegates, the lobby conversation, when they went back, the conversations were largely predominantly about the UPI payments, which was a huge success. That counter there at the G20 Summit was a huge success. Many people were very interested how India has been able to create the digital payment ecosystem, which has been a roaring success. And of course, Chandrayaan 3 was also majorly talked about, a story of change, a country which rich cultural heritage with scientific temper, which wants to move forward, was the buzzing narrative. And in all these geopolitical events, of course, these declarations and joint statements are important, but the touch and feel or the kind of message a country is able to communicate is equally important.
You're absolutely right. India has a scientific and technological base, which it showcased recently by landing a spacecraft on the moon's south pole, becoming the first country to do so. India is also one of the world's most ethnically and culturally diverse nations. Its immense size, its immense diversity pose major challenges, and yet India has been a success story. Its democratic framework is a pillar of stability. It symbolizes unity and diversity.
Sure.
So while others can look at India and learn as to how India manages to succeed, India can also learn from others, because it's always a two-way street.
Yeah.
And just the way others who came to New Delhi for the summit, presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs, were curious about India's success story, India also ought to be curious about how others are prospering, how others are succeeding. Because only by being curious, by trying to learn from others, can we succeed further.
Mr. Sajjanar, coming to you and talking to you, three countries have been dominating the narrative in many ways: Russia, China, and of course the bilateral with Canada and the kind of statements that had come out. I want to talk vis-a-vis China, because there's this major infrastructure project, a corridor that has been announced. The response in the Chinese media shows that the government, the present communist regime in China, was not really happy with those kind of developments or the sort of narrative which is coming in. How do you think India was able to forge a consensus to get this together at the G20, considering the fact that the Western superpowers do want to tout it as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, but the minister concerned and the government officials repeatedly have said that, look, you have to look at it as an independent infrastructure project which is going to boost trade and economy across the regions. And yes, it might be an alternative to BRI, but it's not really some kind of an answer. That's the position India has taken so far.
Yeah, I think it's the right position, because let's put it this way. Comparisons are odious, and any comparison of this is one project. BRI has been going on for the last 10 years. All of us know that, what are the problems with the BRI projects in a large number of places, whether it is debt, whether it is economic viability, it is, ecological sustainability, etc. No new jobs being created in the recipient countries, etc. There are a huge lot of problems. I think we should really be starting on a fresh slate, and I think this is a very ambitious project. The fact that it has been launched right now is doesn't mean that it has started functioning, started working.
Yeah.
I think it is still a challenge, because how will the funding come, where will it go? So I think all those challenges are there. So rather than sort of beating your chest and saying that we are here to sort of confrontation with the BRI.
Yeah.
I don't think that is the right way to go. Also, whatever might be the ultimate benefits or the fallouts from this, whether it's as far as the economic benefits are concerned, or even geostrategic, because I think that it has a very strong, powerful geostrategic message, which could possibly even more important than the economic aspect of it, because China's footprint has been increasing in West Asia, in the Middle East. Xi Jinping's visit to Saudi Arabia, $400 billion deal with Iran. So I think the fact that Europe, US and India are getting together and coming to this region, I think it is a very powerful signal and a very powerful message that all countries need to take note of.
I do want to talk to Professor Brahmachalani about the country of Canada, and I'm not going to quote any government official because the Honorable Minister is on record to say that, look, we have tried to keep all the partners together, and we're also working on different issues that have erupted between India and Canada, including the Khalistan issue. But if you'll go by the reports of the Canadian media or the kind of reports that have been published in the international press, many call it a cold shoulder that was meted out to Justin Trudeau. Professor Chilani, do you agree with that assessment? Was it really a cold shoulder in some ways, in some symbolic ways that was meted out?
If you look at the Prime Minister's tweets, Prime Minister Modi's tweets, as he was meeting leaders on a bilateral basis, he often began his tweet by saying, I had an excellent meeting with so-and-so.
Yes.
Or we had a very, very productive meeting with so-and-so. But when it came to his meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, he just said, I met Prime Minister Trudeau. That's how he began his tweet. It was quite indicative of the fact that this wasn't exactly a very cordial meeting.
Yeah.
And then came the MEA's hard-hitting statement. India really issues strong statements. In fact, this statement that the MEA issued clearly indicated that Prime Minister Modi chastised Prime Minister Trudeau about the fact that Canada under Trudeau has increasingly given space and sanctuary to Sikh extremists that are inciting violence against Indian diplomats, against Indian diplomatic missions, and they're doing things that are contrary to international norms. And yet Trudeau's government has tolerated all this because Trudeau's government relies on a coalition that is aligned with radical Sikh elements in Canada.
Right.
And therefore, they're willing to turn a blind eye to even acts of violence, arson acts against Indian diplomatic missions. They're turning a blind eye to even threats against Indian diplomats. So the Indians really made it very clear that this was unacceptable conduct on the part of the Canadian government. And unless Canada changed course, relations with India would suffer. That was a message that India drove home, and I'm glad that they did that.
Yeah. I also want to bring into discussion Pathikrit Payne, who's joining us on the broadcast. He's a geopolitical expert. He's with us on the show. Good evening, Pathikrit. Thank you for joining us on the show. So we're playing out that exclusive conversation with Dr. S Jaishankar. The Foreign Affairs Minister has spoken about various issues, including the success of G20, relations with China, and various other host of issues which have dominated the discussion ever since that G20 Summit here in New Delhi was a roaring success. One point that I began the discussion with is the position of India to forge alliances, build consensus. Dr. Jaishankar argued that yes, there was a lot of hard work that went from the side of India, diplomatic efforts that were taken from different sides, but at the same time, the peculiar position of India is seen as some kind of a country seen as a bridge between the warring factions or in a world which is deeply divided. Would you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely. Let me tell you, Anusha, I have been deeply involved with the G20 as chief coordinator of one of the engagement groups. So we have seen over the last 19 months the enormous amount of effort that has been put by the Ministry of External Affairs, the Prime Minister's office, the G20 Secretariat under Mr. Amitabh Kant, and the norm of G20 is that you have to have consensus, otherwise the communique doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen on voting at all. It happens on consensus. So what happens for every paragraph there are negotiations, therefore every sentence there is a negotiation. The alternate to having a communique in case there is no consensus is to have an outcome document with a special paragraph by the chair. But enormous amount of effort was made by the G20 Secretariat to make sure that a consensus is brought in, and that consensus came primarily because of India's negotiation capability and because of the personal rapport that Prime Minister has. Unfortunately today, if you look at the West, this is my personal opinion, they have burnt their bridges with Russia, to a great extent with China also. And I think today India stands at a very, very critical inflection point as a country which has not only built the bridges but has nurtured the bridges with Global South, with Africa, and is the only country which has very good relation both with Russia and the West. So I think what the role that India has played in terms of creating a better world, I think it's going to set a very, very high standard for the rest of the G20 summits that would happen henceforth. What India has done in terms of giving prominence to G20 all over again, primarily from the perspective of bringing a redefining approach in terms of how family should be given importance, how the concept of inclusive agenda has to be given importance. These are very, very critical things, and a lot of effort has been made and put in by the Prime Minister's office, by the MEA, by the G20 Secretariat. The amount of effort they have put, there's one thing, Anusha, I want to tell you, apart from Delhi, there has been, we all know, 200 plus events that happened of G20 across the country.
Yes,
everybody had an opportunity to go everywhere and see how India has developed.
Right.
Not only that, there has been outreach programs by the engagement groups, like Y20, which is into 3,000 to 4,000 such events. So we have included everybody. It's unimaginable the way things have happened.
And in a divided world, as has been argued, what can be a better message than Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, or the world is one family? And of course, India has to assert that message. I thank you all gentlemen for joining us on the broadcast. Mr. Ashok Sajjanar, Professor Brahmachalani and Patikrit Pain. Once again, playing out that excerpt from that interview where Dr. Jaishankar talks about how the consensus was built at the G20 Summit. Listen in.
All the focus, of course, has been on the joint declaration, and 12 hours before the declaration was officially adopted, negotiators were still not sure whether they would arrive at it. So give us what was the inside story. How did it actually come through?
Well, I don't know about 12 hours. I can tell you it was much closer than that.
Much closer than 12 hours.
I mean, let me roll back here a bit. It was not that we thought a declaration wouldn't come out.
Okay.
But because I think, somewhere all of us, certainly, the team we had, Sherpa, myself, and I kept PM apprised from time to time what was happening. We had a sense eventually that we'll get there.
Okay.
But having said that, you have to get there.
Yes.
And what would happen is, it's like, we have it nailed down, and then something else would happen, and then we'd say, no, somebody is bracketed. So it was never done till it's done, and that kept coming closer and closer and closer, so much so that even in the forenoon of that day,
on Saturday morning,
9th September, while session 1 was going on, we still had some issues to be nailed down. This was obviously you could say at one level a source of concern or tension or whatever it is. But again, for those of us who've done a lot of these things before, this is how big international events go, that it really goes down to the wire, and you've got to hold your nerve, you've got to make that last push, and which is what we were doing even as people were arriving, even as between session 1 and session 2 we took a break. Even then we were still kind of
not over the line.
Well, we were trying to get everybody into confirming that they were comfortable with it. In some cases there were holds on certain issues, so it was a kind of a live action,
like a cricket match.
Yes, till the very end.
So you did mention in the press conference as well, the emerging bloc of countries, which is Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, along with India, played a role in helping narrow down differences and finding a text that's acceptable to all. Can you elaborate on that role, and what may that mean, the coming together of this emerging bloc?